Welcome back to Lost in History, a video series examining the history of Indigenous affairs in Canada. In this video, we're taking a high-level look at the treaty-making process between Indigenous nations and the Crown, agreements that continue to shape the ongoing Crown-Indigenous relationship to this day. Since the early 1700s, agreements have been concluded between First Peoples and settlers in what is today Canada. These treaties were to establish trade, forge military alliances, and ensure peaceful settlement. They also made binding promises and obligations on the signing parties that continue to be enforced today. And treaty making continues in many regions of Canada as well. Despite their role in the history of relationship building, treaties have often been a source of conflict between Indigenous peoples and the Government of Canada. Let's dive in. Treaties are agreements and accords made between the Crown and Indigenous nations. They establish and define the specific rights, benefits, and obligations of the treaty signatories. They solidify relations between First Peoples and settlers, as well as deal with issues related to land title and the usage of land and resources. Treaties are also forms of constitutional documents where the rights they define are protected by the Canadian Constitution. The arrival of Europeans in North America meant that new relationships needed to be made. In short order, alliances were established with both commercial and military goals. For the French and the British, these were important for the financial success and military needs of the colonies. First Nations, for their part, knew that these relationships would bring European goods into their communities. These alliances were built on a new way of interacting, a so-called forest diplomacy. It used both European and First Nations protocols like the signing of documents and the exchange of wampum. The French incorporated wampum into their dealings with a wide arc of allies, such as the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron. The British, for their part, were very reliant on the Covenant chain, their alliance with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This alliance bound the British to the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee through mutual respect and non-interference. It even had a built-in dispute resolution mechanism process so that grievances could be addressed. As more and more settlers arrived, the colonies needed more land. In many cases, land speculators were quick to take advantage of the greed of colonial governors and the trust of First Nations. Several fraudulent land purchases were concluded by the 1740s that dispossessed and cheated First Nations. Individual settlers also ignored the rights of Indigenous peoples by squatting on their lands and disrupting their traditional land usage. By the outbreak of the 7 Years' War with France, Britain's alliances were severely damaged. In 1755, William Johnson was appointed a superintendent of the new Indian Department. His mission was to repair these broken relationships. After Britain took control over parts of the French colony of Acadia, it needed to find a way to cohabitate with France's Indigenous allies. Colonial officials negotiated a series of treaties with the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples between 1725 and 1779. These agreements promised peaceful relations after military conflicts. They also re-established friendly relations between settlers and Indigenous peoples. Other treaties between Britain and those First Nations supporting the French were made in the St. Lawrence Valley. By 1760, France had lost nearly all of its lands in New France. As the French fell, so too did the long-standing alliance with the Seven Nations of the St. Lawrence Valley. That summer, at Swigachi on Lake Ontario, Sir William Johnson offered terms of peace to the Seven Nations. In exchange for their neutrality in the final battle at Montreal, Johnson promised that their lands and villages would not be disturbed. Another treaty was concluded a few days later near Montreal. On September 5, 1760, General James Murray, commander of the British forces, and the Huron-Wendat concluded an agreement that protected the Huron villages and interests near Quebec City. These agreements with the British established peaceful, if somewhat uneasy, relations with various First Nation allies of New France. And these treaties did not deal with the rights over lands. Britain and later Canada did not pay much attention to them after their signing. Despite this, First Nation signatories have been constantly calling on the Crown to respect the agreements. It would take the decisions of the courts for Canada to see that it still had obligations under these treaties. By the Treaty of Paris of 1763, France ceded nearly all of its North American colonies. With no other European competition, officials in London wanted to demonstrate British authority in North America. As a result, King George III issued a proclamation on the 7th of October 1763 to announce a new administration of British North America. It also wanted to clarify Britain's relations with First Nations. The proclamation set the Appalachian Mountains as a hard western border for the American colonies. It also stated that the lands to the west of the colonies were to be Indian territories, where there could be no settlement. The proclamation also wanted to prevent shady land purchases that were damaging relations with First Nations, so it prohibited all colonial governors from concluding any treaties with First Nations. It then set out protocols and procedures to be used when acquiring First Nations land. It stated that individuals couldn't buy land from First Nations. Only the representatives of the Crown could do that. Treaty negotiations had to be done in a public meeting of the First Nations, who had interests over the lands to be purchased. In the 20 years following the proclamation, the treaties in what is now Canada were mostly for lands around trading posts and military posts. The outbreak of the American War of Independence and the recognition of the United States of America in 1783 brought big changes to the treaty-making process. Some 30,000 United Empire Loyalist refugees moved into the remaining British colonies in North America. Also, many First Nations who had fought alongside the British, especially from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, were also dispossessed by the war. The Indian Department wanted to have agreements in place before the arrival of settlers in any area. It set out to buy the lands along the shores of the St. Lawrence River and the lower Great Lakes. This first wave of land treaties started in 1784 and ended in 1812. The end of the War of 1812 brought new changes to settler-First Nation relations, as Britain no longer saw First Nations as military allies. A second wave of treaties started in 1818 as more and more settlers arrived in North America. These new settlers often occupied lands faster than treaties could be concluded, increasingly dispossessing First Nations. By 1862, some 30 land surrender treaties were concluded and covered nearly all of the lands of what is today Southern Ontario. These treaties were documented by the colonial officials who negotiated them. These written records formed the basis of the Crown's interpretation of the agreements. To colonial officials, these were land purchases where First Nations got specific amounts of money or goods, yearly payments, and sometimes reserves for their own use. First Nations have always stated that these written records do not include all of the promises made, or that the lands weren't sold at all. To this day, they continue to challenge the Crown's understanding of these agreements. In addition, many of the records of these treaties had numerous shortcomings and problems. After a century of complaints about these treaties, commissions of inquiry were set up to look into these treaties in 1916 and 1923. In 1923, two new treaties, known as the Williams Treaties, were signed with the hope of settling any outstanding Indigenous claims in Central Ontario. Indigenous people had been exploiting the mineral resources along the shores of Lake Superior and Lake Huron for millennia, and now newcomers were eyeing these resources for themselves. As there were no treaties here, the Anishinaabe saw these miners and prospectors as trespassers who were stealing their resources. They demanded that a treaty be concluded. In 1850, William Benjamin Robinson was sent to represent the Crown in treaty negotiations for the northern watersheds of Lake Superior and Lake Huron. Known as the Robinson-Huron and Robinson-Superior treaties, these were different from those made in the southern regions of the province. They covered a huge territory and tried to make a deal with all of the First Nations in an area instead of with individual communities. They specified that reserve lands were to be set aside for each community. The treaties also specified the rights of First Nations who signed the treaties, like for hunting and fishing, and for the yearly payments by the Crown to individual members. The Robinson Treaties became the model for the treaties of Western Canada after Confederation. Despite this, the Crown's interpretation has been continuously challenged by First Nation signatories as too narrow and one-sided. On the Pacific Coast, the relationship between European settlers and the region's Indigenous peoples evolved rather differently. Until the 1840s, there wasn't much interest in establishing colonies as Europeans focused on the fur trade. Agents of the Hudson's Bay Company wanted to keep the relationship with West Coast Indigenous peoples on commercial matters relating to the fur trade. But in 1849, the Hudson's Bay Company moved its base of operations to Vancouver Island, and it received a royal charter to formally establish a colony on the island. The lead agent for the company at Fort Victoria was James Douglas, who had deep experience negotiating with First Nations. He knew that the company needed the Salish peoples for its commercial and colonial success. He pushed for formal treaties that would help ensure the viability of the colony and to confirm Indigenous interests in the area. Between 1850 and 1854, Douglas and the Indigenous leaders of Vancouver Island concluded 14 separate treaties. These treaties were to provide cash payments and goods to First Nation signatories. They specified villages would be reserved for First Nations and that rights to hunt and fish would continue as formerly. These treaties only covered about 800 square kilometers of land. The different First Nations who signed these treaties continue to have unresolved Indigenous rights and interests on Vancouver Island. In 1867, Canada was looking to expand westward and open lands west of Ontario for settlement and agriculture. The Canadian government knew that it had to address Indigenous rights and land title throughout the Northwest Territories with treaties before this could happen. Canada wanted to show its authority and control over the West as it feared American annexation. It also wanted to clear the way so that a railway could be built to the Pacific. In addition, it wanted to avoid the conflicts and violence between Indigenous peoples and settlers like in the United States. First Nations were not opposed to the treaty process with Canada. They wanted to establish new relations with newcomers to protect their lands and their people. By the 1870s, Indigenous peoples of the prairies were in an increasingly difficult situation. Epidemics and disease were frequent, and the bison herds of the Great Plains were collapsing. Indigenous leaders wanted the government to help their people during these crises. They also wanted assistance in adapting to a new way of life that wasn't centered on the bison. In many cases, they wanted treaties quickly and pressured Canada to negotiate even faster than it was initially willing to do. With all of this in mind, Canadian officials and Indigenous leaders came together to negotiate 11 treaties across Western and Northern Canada. Known as the Numbered Treaties, these agreements were made in two phases. Treaties 1 to 7 were concluded between 1871 and 1877 for the areas of the Southern Prairies, while Treaties 8 to 11 were made between 1899 and 1921, covering Northern Ontario, the Northern Prairies, and the Mackenzie Valley. These treaties were more than simple land surrenders. They included one-time payments and annuities to individuals, reserve lands, and continued rights to hunt and fish. They also promised schools for communities, agricultural tools and cattle to assist with the transition to farming. There were also clauses for ammunition for hunting and supplies for fishing. These treaties aren't all the same either. They all had unique clauses, like in Treaty 6 that had a clause relating to the supply of a medicine chest and famine relief. Like the earlier treaties concluded in the East, the Crown relied on the written terms of the agreements. For Canadian officials, these treaties were like massive land purchase contracts, where all of the clauses were written into the documents. To First Nations, they were agreements that formalized relationships between First Nations and settlers, and many clauses are missing from the written text. In addition, the Indian Act and other paternalistic actions of Canada are seen as violations of the spirit and intent of these agreements. First Nations continue to call on Canada to better implement their interpretation of the treaties, instead of the literal interpretation of the treaty text. In 1973, 3 court decisions confirmed that there were unresolved Indigenous rights in Canada. After a 50-year pause, the Canadian government restarted the treaty-making process. This new process was to negotiate agreements for Indigenous rights where they weren't covered by a treaty. This is known as the Comprehensive Land Claims process. This process was cumbersome and difficult, and as a result, only a few agreements were concluded in the 1970s and 80s. Indigenous groups weren't happy with what the government was offering. They wanted agreements where they didn't have to surrender all of their rights and still had influence over their traditional lands. The policy was amended in 1986 to allow for more rights and interests to be retained by the signing Indigenous nations. And after 1995, self-government agreements became built into many of these so-called modern treaties. Despite these changes, the process is long and difficult. Since 1975, there have been nearly 30 agreements concluded and negotiations ongoing in many parts of Canada. Even with these modern agreements, there continues to be disagreements between the parties as to the implementation of these new treaties. For over 300 years, treaty making has been at the center of the relationships between North America's original inhabitants and newcomers. These agreements are a significant reason behind the relatively peaceful settlement of Europeans in what is today Canada. Treaties in Canada continue to be enforced, and new treaties continue to be made across the country. But Canada and Indigenous nations often don't agree on the meaning, intent, and significance of these agreements. Where there may have been a meeting of the minds when they were concluded, this isn't necessarily the case today. Treaties are not simply part of the evolving Crown-Indigenous relationship. They are at its foundation. For more information on the history of treaty making in Canada, please see the links in the description below. That's all for now. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.